Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another video in my history series. So last month I went to see the Tutankhamun Treasures of the Golden Pharaoh exhibition in London. It's an exhibition that shows 150 authentic objects from the Tomb of Tutankhamun and has spent years travelling the world. It's on at the Saatchi Gallery in London until May 2020, when apparently the objects are set to return to Egypt forever. The tickets are fairly expensive, but if you're a fellow history geek and you do get the chance to visit if you're in London, I would highly recommend it, and you've only got a few months to get down there, so definitely make it snappy. But visiting the exhibition actually inspired me to create a video all about the life and discovery of Tutankhamun, the forgotten boy pharaoh of Egypt. But before we get into this video, of course, I would just like to thank Magellan TV for once again sponsoring. Magellan TV is a documentary streaming site with hundreds of documentaries about a huge range of different topics. For someone who watches as many documentaries as I do, it really is invaluable to have a whole streaming service dedicated to just documentaries. I cannot recommend them enough. They have everything from true crime to science, history, nature, and everything in between, with new programmes added weekly that can be watched anywhere on your TV, laptop and mobile. It's compatible with Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Google Play and iOS, and loads of the programmes are available in 4K as well. As always, I'm going to give you a couple of documentary recommendations that I hope you would enjoy as much as I have. And this week's choice was obvious because Magellan TV have so many documentaries on the ancient Egyptians. So the first one I'm going to recommend is King Tut, Forgotten Treasures, in case you want to continue learning about Tutankhamun. And the second one is Ramesses II, The Great Journey, just in case you want to learn about a different pharaoh in a slightly different time. But honestly, there's so many documentaries on there about ancient Egypt, it's crazy. Our modern story of Tutankhamun begins with a man called Howard Carter. The two names are almost intertwined at this point, and I can't tell you the story of King Tut without telling you the story of Howard Carter. Howard was born in May 1874 and he grew up to become a very talented artist, trained by his artist father, Samuel Carter. A lifelong interest in Egypt began at a very young age for Howard when his father painted a portrait of a well-known Egyptologist, and Howard's interest was sparked from there. At the age of 17, Howard finds a job in Egypt working for an archaeologist who needed an artist to draw his findings. You're talking about a time here, the late 1800s, early 1900s, when photography was very expensive and rare, and colour photography was non-existent. It was much more viable for archaeologists to pay a talented artist to draw their findings instead of photographing them. It was vital that the inscriptions and hieroglyphics and just the artefacts found in tombs were copied perfectly, and that was the job of 17-year-old Howard. However, it soon became clear that Howard didn't just have a talent for art. He was fascinated by the whole process of archaeology. Just 3 months after he arrived in Egypt, he began learning the disciplines of archaeology from Flinders Petrie, who was one of the greats of archaeology at the time. Howard goes from artist to Egyptologist and begins to supervise a number of excavations around the ancient city of Thebes, a city that we now know as Luxor. At the age of 25, he was appointed as Inspector General of Monuments for Upper Egypt by the Egyptian Antiquities Service, which was this huge honour, and Howard begins getting funding for his own excavation projects. He brought this new perspective to the excavations and made huge steps to advance the protection of existing excavation sites and tombs. He basically realised that it was probably a good idea that they were very careful with this very old stuff, and he took extra steps to ensure that everything was looked after just a little bit more than other archaeologists were looking after it. So he was doing really well in the world of archaeology. But soon things would take a turn for the worse for Howard, whose views did differ from a lot of his fellow archaeologists. Howard's patch where he would excavate included an area called Saqqara, a necropolis where there were multiple pyramids and loads of tombs across the Nile from modern day Cairo. It was Howard's job to excavate and preserve this area. According to Howard's own version of the story, one day in 1905, some really rowdy French tourists cause a commotion at the Saqqara necropolis. They break a load of furniture, they're really rude to guards, and they force their way into the tombs without paying entry and cause significant damage whilst they do so. An altercation ensues and Howard is summoned to quell this dispute, at which point he orders the tourists to leave. They did, but they put up a fight and they injured multiple guards as they do so. And the French go back and they complain to the French ambassador, who demands an apology from Howard Carter. But Howard refuses, and he actually attempts to take legal steps against these French tourists. And Howard really holds his ground here. His job is to protect the tombs and the people where he lived. And this becomes sort of an all-out war between the British and French tabloids, and ultimately the British and French governments. As a result, Howard Carter resigns from his post. For the next 3 years, Howard flits around Egypt, doing small self-employed jobs, just staying on the down low. But then a man called George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, more commonly known as Lord Carnarvon, arrives on the scene. He's an amateur with an avid interest in Egypt, and he had money and he wanted to excavate near Thebes and make the next big discovery. He's recommended to contact Howard Carter. And this is where the story begins to intertwine with Tutankhamun. In 1905, a cup was found by an American Egyptologist called Theodore Davis, and this cup was inscribed with the name Tutankhamun, a name that had never been heard before. Now, it's strange to think of a time when nobody knew of this pharaoh, who is now arguably the most famous of them all, a household name. But this discovery, this cup with this name that they'd never heard, fascinated the Egyptologists. How could it be that they'd never seen this name before? Not long after, the name pops up once again when Davis discovers a single empty chamber containing a small amount of gold foils with the name Tutankhamun on again, and his successor, a man called I. So when Davis discovers this bit of gold foil with this name on in a chamber in the middle of the Valley of Kings, he just assumes that this is the looted tomb of Tutankhamun. Following the many excavations of the late 1800s, most thought that the valley had been searched in its entirety. Over the 3,000 plus years, most tombs had already been looted by grave robbers by the time these Egyptologists, these archaeologists got there, leaving little left to actually be found in the Valley of the Kings. So Davis just assumes that this was his tomb, it's been looted, and that's that. But Howard Carter had a hunch. He had this hunch that there was still more left to find, hidden in the depths of the valley. And he was not intending to stop until he found the tomb of this obscure pharaoh from the 18th dynasty. No one knew this name, Tutankhamun, at the time, only really Egyptologists. But Howard just had this feeling, and he wasn't ready to give up on it. He wanted to discover more about this very obscure pharaoh. He knew that the empty chamber that Davis found and attributed to this king was unlikely to be the tomb of King Tut, since his mummy wasn't found in a collection of royal mummies that had been found very nearby previously. Howard knew that this untouched tomb must still be out there somewhere, as Tutankhamun's name hadn't been heard of for so many years. If his tomb had already been looted, surely they would have heard his name before. There would be other artefacts out there with his name on. But there weren't. So Howard Carter joins forces with Lord Carnarvon, who employs him to supervise excavations of noble tombs in Thebes. These weren't royal tombs, they were just noble tombs, and Carter knew that by searching here he wasn't going to find the tomb of King Tut. But it meant that now Carter had a steady job and a salary doing what he was good at once again. And soon he was supervising all of Lord Carnarvon's excavations, and in 1915 or 1914, depending on the source, Theodore Davis, the man who held the excavation permits for the Valley of the Kings, died. So this permit for the Valley of the Kings was now up for grabs, and Lord Carnarvon acquires it, and Howard Carter begins to explore. However, then the First World War begins, and the excavations are interrupted for quite a few years as Howard begins working for the British government as a translator. He resumes his search towards the end of 1917, but year after year he has little success in finding the tomb of Tutankhamun. Lord Carnarvon is growing restless with this lack of results from the excavations that he's personally funding, and he actually just returns back to England. He's bored now. But Howard convinces him to try out for one last season. 1922 was his very last chance. Who knew when he'd get the funding to continue his search? He had to find the tomb that year. The excavation season of 1922 begins on the 1st of November. Just 3 days later, the world would change forever, and this was all down to a young water boy who would twice a day bring water to the excavation site for workers. He would bring water via donkey and set these big, large pottery jars of water onto the floor, having to dig out some sand to set the jars upright. but whilst doing so, this water boy notices a stone underneath that looked as if it had been sculpted, and he rushes off to inform the excavators. They soon discover this piece of stone is the first of a set of stairs that led down to a tomb, and they begin to clear the sand away, step by step. There's a famous photo of this water boy with a scarab necklace placed over his neck, one of the treasures found in the tomb. And there's another famous photo of this boy as an old man, holding the photo of himself as a boy. That one photo was circulated worldwide for years and years and years, and it funded him for the rest of his life. The next day, they discovered that these steps led to a door, and Howard noticed that the plaster walls of the stairway were adorned with a special stamp that he knew was only used on royal tombs. He knew he had hit the jackpot because it also seemed that the entrance was still completely sealed, although he did later notice that the upper left of the doorway had actually been broken and resealed, so he was very nervous that he was going to open the door to find this tomb empty. Howard writes to Carnarvon in England and requests that he comes straight over. He wants to wait until they're both there so they can open the tomb together, something I'm sure he regretted many times as this was 1922 and it took Carnarvon almost 3 weeks to arrive in Egypt. On the morning of Saturday the 25th of November 1922, they removed the first doorway of the tomb, which led to this dark passageway just filled with limestone. On the 26th, the second doorway at the end of the passageway is opened, which led into an antechamber. Howard made a tiny breach in the upper left-hand corner of the doorway, large enough to stick a candle through and peer in. Lord Carnarvon asks, "Can you see anything?" To which Howard famously replies, "Yes, wonderful things." As far as he could see was gold, statues, ornate objects, furniture, everything just glistened in the candlelight. And it also seemed that everything was intact. Now, we're not talking about a tomb here in the form of a single room with a mummy in the middle. The Egyptians didn't do things by half, especially when it came to royalty. The Tomb of Tutankhamun consisted of an antechamber, the first room that Howard laid eyes on, but then an annex next to it, a treasury, and a burial chamber in which the mummy was enclosed in 4 nested, gilded wooden shrines, and a sarcophagus containing 3 nested coffins, all of which depicted the fallen pharaoh. The innermost coffin was made of pure gold and contained the mummy, still wearing his death mask and wrapped in linen. And this tomb was a pretty small one for a pharaoh, hard to believe. It's actually speculated that the tomb was built for someone else, but was used for Tutankhamun after his sudden death, but we'll delve more into that later. Inside the tomb was everything that any young pharaoh would have required for his journey into the afterlife. I'm going to put up some photos on the screen now that I took whilst at the exhibit in London. These are just a few of the incredibly ornate things found in the tomb. There were over 5,000, I think it was about 5,300 objects in total, and it took Carter and his team almost 10 years to catalogue everything. It was an incredibly slow process, but it was of utmost importance that everything was preserved and documented correctly, so they took their time. There were chariots, beds, cups, children toys, statues, furniture. For me, one of the most impressive things was one of the large statues that stood at the door of the burial chamber. I'll post a photo or maybe a video, but it doesn't quite do it justice. It was huge and incredibly ornate. But why did the Egyptians feel the need to do such extravagant burials? Why would a dead person need all of this buried with them? This is where we get into the Egyptian history part of the video, so buckle in. The ancient Egyptians were very spiritual people and they believed strongly in the afterlife. At the time of Tutankhamun's rule, the 18th dynasty, it was believed that life on earth was only part of the eternal journey, that death was not the end, merely the beginning. But the afterlife took many different forms depending on the social status of the deceased. The better a life a person lived, the better their afterlife would be. If the gods saw fit, one would spend their afterlife eternally in the perfect paradise known as the Field of Reeds, which was basically a mirror image of one's time on earth. So Egyptians would try their best to create the best life they possibly could on earth, so this would then be mirrored in the afterlife. Therefore, the higher the social status on earth, the better life they had ahead of them in the Field of Reeds. But of course, it wasn't easy to get there. To reach eternal paradise, the deceased had to first pass through the 12 gates of the netherworld, a place swirling with danger and evil forces controlled by magic. They believed in 3 spirits: the Ark, the Bar, and the Car. These are the immortal soul, the personality, and the life force in order. The Ark would be the spirit that would embark on this perilous journey through the afterlife, whilst the soul took the form of the Bar, often depicted as a bird that would fly to the land of the living during the day and return to the mummy at night. The Car was the deceased's very essence, which resided within the mummy. So the Egyptians very much believed in life after death. They believed in these spirits. But they believed that this afterlife could only happen if the body was preserved so well that the spirits could recognise the deceased, which is why they mummified their dead. Mummification was a result of this desire to preserve a corpse for all eternity, so the dead could live on forever, so their spirits could recognise them. I could probably make a whole other video about mummification and the practices. It would take up a little bit too much space in this video, but let me know if you want it. But that basically brings us full circle back round to why did they need so much stuff in the tombs with them? Well, so they could use these items to fight through the netherworld to eternal paradise, of course. The more stuff they had with them, the more of a chance they stood at being able to successfully fight through to the field of reeds. Again, I can make a whole video about the Egyptian spiritual beliefs and gods and the afterlife, but that's it in a nutshell for your understanding of this particular story, which is still about Tutankhamun, I promise. So now we have this pharaoh who's been placed in this incredible tomb with all these incredible things surrounding him. But it's actually a tomb that was most likely built for a nobleman, not for royalty. And the Egyptologists were still baffled. They had so much knowledge of the ancient Egyptian rule. They knew the names of so many pharaohs. But why did it seem that Tutankhamun was all but forgotten? Why had his name been wiped from history and only discovered through this random finding of a cup that just happened to have his name inscribed? Tutankhamun reigned for only 9 years, forced to take the throne when he was just 8 or 9 years old. He ruled from 1334 to 1325 BC, over 3,500 years ago. As he was a child, he would have been overseen for most of his reign by the man who would eventually succeed him to the throne, a man called Ai, along with other people as well. Now, his father was a man called Akhenaten, and to understand why Tutankhamun's name disappeared from history, you have to know the story of his father, an incredibly controversial and kinda hated pharaoh. He was best known for attempting to change the entire religion of ancient Egypt, something that you can probably guess didn't go down all too well. Around the time that Akhenaten took control of Egypt, it was at its peak. Egypt had become one of the most powerful and wealthy nations in the world. His father was Pharaoh Amenhotep III, and Akhenaten at the beginning of his rule was also called Amenhotep. He was Pharaoh Amenhotep IV. But this Pharaoh Amenhotep IV had some very controversial ideas. Egypt at the time was a polytheistic society. They believed in many gods, some of which you'll probably still know the names of today: Isis, Osiris, Horus, and these were some of the many gods that Egyptians worshipped. But almost immediately after Amenhotep IV takes reign, he begins to go a little off the beaten path. Rather than honour Amun along with the rest of the gods, he begins to build temples dedicated to a new form of sun god, who was known by the very snappy name of the Living One, Horus of the Horizon, who rejoices in the horizon in his identity of light, which is the sun disk. Snappy. Before long, he shortened this name just to Aten, which was the Egyptian word for sun disk. In the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV changes his name to Akhenaten to reflect his worship of Aten. It was unheard of for somebody to be monotheistic in this time, which is really strange to think about in today's world where most religions are monotheistic. But no one believed in just one god back then. But Akhenaten, he did, and he strongly believed in just one god. But it wasn't just enough for Akhenaten to believe in this one god. He was pharaoh. Everyone had to follow his beliefs. Eventually he would go on to ban all of the traditional gods altogether. He would close all temples that praised any god other than Aten. And around the same time that he changed his name, he decides to build a new royal capital as well. Somewhere free of existing religious associations and somewhere he could have free reign to do whatever he wanted. Akhenaten moves the capital from Thebes to a new site that he named Akhetaten, which is present-day Amarna. He claimed that Aten himself had chosen this site as the place that he should be worshipped. It took them about 3 years roughly to build this entire city. But not only did Akhenaten change the entire religious face of Egypt, but even things like the style of art changed. Statues made at this time are very real to life, showing royals in all of their beauty and decay. And it's really interesting because you can very much see the differences in art from like pre-Akhenaten and post-Akhenaten. One of the most famous pieces of art from this time today is the bust of Nefertiti, who was actually the wife of Akhenaten. I'm sure you've heard the name Nefertiti before. She's revered as one of the most beautiful women of all time. But whilst Akhenaten was living this new life of luxury in Akhenaten with his beautiful wife and family, the rest of Egypt was up in arms. He'd closed all the old temples, leaving people unable to worship their gods. They hated monotheism. He showed an all-round lack of interest in being pharaoh, who was more interested in just controlling the religious aspect of this country than actually worrying about trade and international affairs. Foreign trade began to fall away, the army was discontent, royals from other countries who had been loyal to Egypt for generations began to fall away. Everything basically falls apart under Akhenaten's rule, and eventually when Akhenaten dies in the 17th year of his reign, he just leaves this huge mess behind. He's often referred to nowadays as the Heretic King. After the death of Akhenaten, it's not entirely clear who took over the throne. It seems to me that different historians have different ideas on this. Some say that Nefertiti took over for a bit, some say that Tutankhamun's older sisters took over for a bit, one of them disguised as male. But anyway, it wasn't long until a couple of years later when 8 or 9-year-old Tutankhamun took the throne. A quick overview of King Tut's family history here so you can just have a better understanding of what the hell's going on. So Akhenaten was Tutankhamun's dad, and he was married to Nefertiti, who was his principal wife. But of course he had many other mistresses and wives on the side, as was the norm at this time. But Tutankhamun was not the son of Nefertiti, and is in fact the son of another one of Akhenaten's wives, who is commonly just referred to as the younger lady. They don't know her name. This younger lady was also the full sister of Akhenaten, which makes Tutankhamun the product of incest. It was common in Egyptian times for royal families to inbreed, to keep this bloodline strong. They believed that they were chosen by the gods and therefore they had to keep their blood pure. When Tutankhamun was born, he was actually named Tutankhaten to reflect his father's beliefs in Aten, the one god. He was born with a club foot and a cleft palate thanks to all of the incest, and scoliosis. King Tut representing for Team Scoliosis. But when Tutankhamun takes the throne, he immediately begins to dismantle the legacy of his father, or at least his advisors begin to dismantle this legacy. He's like 8 years old. They change his name to distance himself from Akhenaten, and of course, seeing as he took the throne at such a young age, he mostly had his advisors to oversee his reign. They did pretty much everything. And there's not really a huge amount to report about his time on the throne. As he was so young, he didn't really do much. He had the royal court moved back to Thebes from Amarna and ordered the repair of all the holy sites that his father had destroyed. He sought to restore better relations once again with Egypt's neighbours who had abandoned them, and he was trained in the military, but it's unlikely that he ever actually saw any military action. Shortly after he takes the reign, he marries his half-sister, the daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. She's called Ankhesenamun, which has just taken me about 20 takes to get right. He was around 8 or 9 years old. She was 13, and there's actually rumours that Ankhesenamun was actually married to her father before this and married to her maternal grandfather after, who may or may not have actually been the successor to Tutankhamun. The ancient Egyptian royals were all about keeping it in the family. When Tutankhamun's tomb was opened those thousands of years later, 2 mummified baby girls were actually found in there with him. DNA analysis did indeed confirm that they were definitely his children. One was a full-term stillborn baby, the other likely died in utero about 5 or 6 months, and Tutankhamun and his wife had no other children together. His bloodline ended with him. And then suddenly, Tutankhamun dies in his late teens. There has been huge speculation over the years as to how he died, as it clearly wasn't of old age. A few people call it one of the greatest mysteries of all time. Maybe I should have made this a midweek mystery video instead of a history video. But it's hard to know for sure what happened, as Tutankhamun's body was not actually well preserved at all. The mummification process was done incorrectly, meaning that the oils actually harmed the preservation rather than helped. The body was also seemingly damaged both before and after death, before he was discovered and after he was discovered. Yet more clues that suggest that people really wanted to get Tut's burial over and done with. It was just all kind of rushed. They just wanted his name gone from history and to move on. For years it was thought that King Tut had been murdered, a mark on his skull suggesting that he died from blunt force trauma, a blow to the head. But a common theory nowadays that historians tend to lean towards is that he may have actually fallen from a moving chariot, a result of his poor balance due to his club foot. But what is clear is that whatever happened, it was probably an accident. X-rays of the mummy suggest that he'd fractured his thigh, possibly as a result of a fall from maybe a chariot. But he also had malaria. Years of DNA testing found some of the oldest malaria parasites ever isolated on Tut's mummy, along with several others. The fractured leg, combined with malaria and a possible degenerative bone disorder that he suffered with, may have just been too much for Tutankhamun's immune system to handle. He was already a fairly frail and weak king as a result of his inbreeding, and it's noted that 130 walking sticks and canes were discovered in his tomb, many of which had been used. So it's unlikely that he was a victim of murder, as years of speculation suggested. He was likely in an accident and his body just couldn't cope with it. And after this sudden death, he's buried in a tomb that probably wasn't meant for him. There are actually several instances in this tomb where it looks like his name is just written over the top of someone else's, like they've suddenly had to change their plans. Tutankhamun's name was erased from history, as the Egyptians pretty much just wanted to rid themselves of any trace of the Heretic King, Akhenaten. When Tutankhamun died, they sealed off the tomb, moved on to I as Pharaoh, and this was done. This whole horrible section of Egypt's history was just wiped away. But inadvertently, this is actually what preserved his legacy, because thieves didn't know his name. They didn't know the name Tutankhamun. They never really went out looking for his tomb, leaving it in its full glory for Howard Carter to find 3,500 years later. The Egyptians believed in two deaths. First, the physical death and journey to the afterlife. Second, when the last person speaks your name. It seems that Tutankhamun is to be spoken about for thousands of years to come. Today his mummy is on display in the underground tomb at Luxor in a climate-controlled glass box designed to prevent any further decomposition. Although his mummy does remain in his tomb, it does seem strange for me that somebody can lay for over 3,000 years undisturbed, only now for thousands of people to be in and out to stare at him on a daily basis. I can't quite put my feelings about this into words. It just seems a bit icky, especially when you know the Egyptians' beliefs around death and the afterlife. But then again, would I like to see the mummy in person? Yes. It's weird, but I'll make do with the exhibition. For many years there were rumours flying around of a curse of the Pharaohs, fuelled by the British newspapers at the time. Daily Mail, mostly, of course, because of course it would be the Daily Mail. Apparently a lot of people who entered this tomb met an early death, including Lord Carnarvon himself, who died just 5 months after the discovery of the first step. He actually just died from complications from an infected mosquito bite on his cheek. It led to pneumonia, and he died. Only 8 of the 58 people present when the tomb was opened died within a dozen years, so it's safe to say that there probably wasn't a curse of the pharaoh. Howard Carter himself died in 1939 at the age of 64, having changed the face of history forever. And that's the story of Tutankhamun and Howard Carter and Akhenaten. Context is pretty important in stories like this. It's hard to focus on just one storyline when you're talking about history. There's so much more I could talk about as well. If you do want the video on mummification or the afterlife, then please let me know down below, as well as let me know any other history topics you want me to talk about. Thank you so much for watching, and make sure that you check out Magellan TV in the first line description down below. Thank you so much for watching my video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.